The main thing we want for the holidays is to see our loved ones, depending on the loved ones. Unfortunately, some of us only see them around this time, assuming we do it all this year with new travel restrictions popping back up around the world. Whatever the case, Aura is a great gift to close the distance all year round. The Aura Smart Frame is a high-resolution screen that doesn't really look like a screen. It's very easy to set up. You can upload photos and ask family members to contribute ahead of time. Then just turn it on for an instant trip down memory lane. Doesn't that sound nicer than letting it all sit on your phone, never looking at those pictures again? That's not the end of it, though. You also get free unlimited photo and video storage through the Aura app. You can share photos and videos from anywhere in the world, and they'll show in their frame instantly. It's really nice for sharing pictures of kiddos. Aura frames are the perfect gift for this holiday season. The New York Times has vouched for them. So has the Wall Street Journal and Forbes. Even Oprah added them to her favorite things for a third year in 2021. You can get someone you love an Aura frame today. It'll come beautifully wrapped and be delivered right to their door for an easy last-minute gift to keep you connected throughout the year. Last year, by the way, these sold out, so don't wait. JBP listeners can visit auraframes.com now and use code JBP for up to $30 off while supplies last. That's AURA frames.com with code JBP for $30 off. Also, guys, Dad's going on tour. If you haven't heard, you can go to jordanbpeterson.com/events to find tickets near you. A bunch of the shows have sold out, so if you're interested in seeing him live, I would check them out fast.
Hey, everybody. I'm going to put up a video from my colleague and friend, Jonathan Pageau, a Russian Orthodox icon carver, a great artist, and a very profound thinker in my estimation. About a month ago, so that would be October of 2021, I listened to a lecture he gave to the Montreal Jung Society on the conceptual structure of Genesis, and I thought it was brilliant. It was like 20 years of thought packed into an hour of lecture, and then also a brilliant Q&A that followed, analyzing some iconic images in the Russian Orthodox tradition. And I thought that it would make an excellent adjunct to my biblical series on Genesis, coming at it from the different tack that Jonathan takes, elucidating the ideas that I had developed, and certainly the ideas that he has developed. I always learn a lot from listening to Jonathan. And so I reached out to him and the Jung Society of Montreal, which kindly gave us permission to repost the lecture, and he agreed to do it. And my production team has been working on it. And so we're pleased to bring it to you. And I hope that you enjoy it even more, or at least as much as you enjoyed the Genesis lectures from a few years ago. And hopefully there's more of this sort of thing to come.
Hi, everybody. My name is David D'Andrea. I'm a college teacher in Montreal. It's my pleasure today to introduce Jonathan Pageau, who I see as one of a small handful of cultural commentators helping us make sense of our strange historical moment. I first came across Pageau in 2017 in the chaos and contestation of that time. The mood of rebellion was especially pervasive on the internet, with the memes of 4chan's edgelords fueling the triumph of Trump and Brexit. We all remember those years not too long ago. And Jordan Peterson hosted Jonathan Pageau on his YouTube channel to talk about what they called the metaphysics of Pepe. Pepe, of course, was that cartoon frog that seemed to symbolize the worst instincts of the alt-right, or maybe just the timeless urge of the jester to poke at the sanctimony of the powerful. Peterson and Pageau's discussion seemed to move beyond the tawdry politics of the moment and grasp something deeper going on. So like many people at that time, I decided to keep an eye on this interesting new commentator. A little bit later, Pageau organized a documentary screening on Jordan Peterson that was held here in Montreal. So I saw that name pop up again. Oh, I think I've heard of that fellow. You may know that Pageau is a carver by profession. He is an editor at the Orthodox Arts Journal. Today, I see him mainly as a YouTube commentator. And in that medium, I see him occupying a role somewhere between an intellectual, a social critic, and, can I say, an entertainer? He speaks with a series of interlocutors, amongst them, of course, Jordan Peterson, Christian commentators like Paul Vanderklay, secular psychologists like John Vervaeke of the University of Toronto, very interesting fellow, novelist Vesper Stamper. These are a few of the guests he's had on who stick out for me. Some recent topics that Pageau has discussed include universal history, this kind of retro idea of a grand narrative that includes and makes sense of everything, right? With, of course, a Christian foundation, the interpretation of scripture, but also symbolism within pop culture. He seems to be fascinated by superhero movies and TV shows, as well as rap stars like Lil Nas X and Kanye West. And I confess that I share that last fascination. Throughout all of this, as Pageau says, symbolism happens. So today it is my great pleasure to introduce him, and I'm hoping that he will lay out a roadmap to the symbolism which is happening today and which maybe is gathering for the near future.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. This is really a wonderful opportunity. I'm surprised to see some people that I know I'm kind of looking at the mosaic here of everybody. Well, not everybody, but some people. So I'm surprised to see some people that I know and then some people that I don't know. And so what I want to do with you today is I want to kind of take you on a kind of symbolic trip. I want to present to you, first of all, let's say the source of the symbolism that I tried to present, the frame, you could say, of the symbolism. I'm going to present it maybe in a little more of a technical way that I usually do, in the more kind of colloquial way that I do on YouTube. So hopefully that'll be okay. And then what I'll do is I'll take you on an example of this symbolic pattern, the very basic example, which is we're going to read the first chapter of Genesis together, and we're going to try to look at how it kind of manifests the symbolic pattern, and how this becomes a kind of map that you can use to interpret the world, but also a map, especially a map that you can use to inhabit your life. And so we'll see that symbolism is not only about interpretation. I mean, as Jungians, you know that it's a way to be and a way to kind of inhabit the world. And so there's an interesting moment right now, I think, in the zeitgeist, in the culture, something like the end of materialism or the end of physicalism. We saw, of course, I think that Jordan Peterson has played a big role in poking at this, kind of poking at the new atheist, this last weird new atheist moment that we had in the early 2000s. And so what we're seeing is kind of materialism running to its end. And it's happening in physics with the problem of the observer. It's happening in things like just this notion of complexity or complexity theory, the problem of emergence. All of these things are bringing materialism to its end. And the way that I like to understand it is that for a while we had this kind of weird duality of mind and body, or mind and matter, where we kind of abstracted the mind into this place that we didn't talk about. And then we look at the world and we interpret reality. And as materialism kind of ran its course, as this kind of scientism ran its course, at some point, you could say there is something of a little moment, a surprising moment of pride, where as we're kind of exhausting the things that we study, people realize that, well, there's this one thing that we haven't studied. It's the thing that's looking at everything else. Like we're studying the world, but all of a sudden we realize that there's a viewer that's doing that studying. And as soon as the materialist eye, you could say, turned towards the viewer, turned towards the interpreter, turned towards trying to understand consciousness, trying to understand meaning itself, then things become very loopy. And the simplicity of the dualistic model stops to make sense. And this happens very much in terms of evolutionary thinking. What evolutionary thinking did in some parts is try to explain the motivations of humans. But when you start to do that, you have a problem, because this human who's talking about evolution is what you're trying to interpret. And so you're actually interpreting the interpreter. And so what has happened is that it's opened the door to all kinds of questions, the problem of emergence, the problem of quality. And one of the big things that's happened is the problem of attention. And this has been manifesting itself in different fields. And it's realizing that the world is too complex, that the world actually is kind of indefinite in its complexity. You know, everything you look at, everything you encounter has an indefinite amount of complexity. And it's made of parts, and those parts also have an indefinite amount of complexity. And you can just scale that down, you know, to the quantum field or whatever. And many thinkers realize, how does this work? How do things scale up between different levels of phenomena? That is, how is it that I can look at a chair and see that the chair is both one thing, it's a chair, but it also is many things. And those many things are also many things. But I can perceive at every level of reality that there's unity. So I can notice a leg of a chair, and I can notice the color of the chair, but I can also see that all of this participates in the being of the chair. And this is like a hard problem. It's a difficult problem, because it ends up infecting all of meaning making, and it infects science, and it's not an infection. It's actually a kind of healing, I think. But it kind of seeps back into science and seeps back into the very way in which we understand the world. And we realize that we have difficulty accounting for the qualities of things using descriptive means, that we have difficulty even accounting for the identity of things using descriptive means. So once we have the identity, we can describe things, but the identity seems to kind of emerge from somewhere else or come from somewhere else, and kind of brings multiplicity into unity. And so what's fascinating is that it has, like I said, it has opened up all of a sudden the possibility for people to understand ancient thinking in a way that until recently was very difficult to understand. And so if we understand, so we realize that the world has to be patterned, that there has to be patterns in the world. And this is more than just a psychological reality. It's not just about describing the psyche of the human person. It's actually a cosmological argument. It's an argument about how reality works, which is that for things to exist, they have to be patterned. And those patterns seem to stack up at different levels of reality, and also seem to exist in smaller patterns, seems to exist in bigger patterns, right? I mean, you can think about it physically or think about it any way you want. And this actually seems to be something which is inevitable for us to be able to even encounter the world. Now, what that means is that it brings back the idea of intelligence, the idea of consciousness, and it can reconnect us to how the ancients talked about it. Some people are talking about something like the Revenge of Aristotle, right? Or the Revenge of Plato, because suddenly when we have to re-enter our experience and try to analyze our experience, we realize that, oh, actually, when Aristotle talked about potentiality and actuality, I experience that every single day of my life, right? I actually encounter the field that presents itself to me as potential, which is brought into patterns, brought into actualities that I need in order to be able to exist, right? And those actualities, those patterns, they're not just mathematical patterns or ideas in the vague Platonic sense that people have, but they're actually teleological. They're purposes, right? And these purposes, they can be regained from evolutionary thinking, which is just the strangest thing in the world. Like, who would have thought that Darwin would bring Plato back? But when we re-enter evolutionary thinking, we realize that we need purposes in order to encounter the world. So it's like this cup, the fact that I recognize it as a cup is because I recognize its purpose to me as a human being. And that actually scales the hierarchy of purposes, even in terms of science, right? People think that science is just a study of phenomena, but we always forget that science is embedded into social systems. And that, for example, the science that will get the most attention will always be the science that is the most fascinating or useful for humans. And the science that will get the least attention, which means the least money, the least effort to study, will be the things that are the least useful for humans. So as soon as you re-embed science into its actual social frame, then all of a sudden, this hierarchy just reappears again. This ancient hierarchy, which is basically, you could call it something like the religious hierarchy. So what it does is that these patterns, these teleological patterns, these patterns with purpose, come back into the way in which we actually exist in the world. So you can understand that ritual suddenly makes sense again. Not only does it make sense, but it's actually inevitable. And you can see everything you do through ritual, because everything you do in the world is patterned teleologically. It's patterned towards purpose. And sometimes, let's say, there are moments in which that purpose will kind of break down, but that is also part of the, let's say, great ritual, which usually involves something like carnival, which involves aspects of chaos on the edges of these patterns. And so so you realize that, like, drinking a cup of water is necessarily ritualized. It has to be teleological, and it has to have a certain form. I have to do certain things in a certain order in order for me to be able to achieve the purpose that I'm reaching with my cup. Now bring this into the human sphere. It's the same. And when I encounter someone, my encounter necessarily has to be ritualized. And you can realize that it has to be ritualized because if you try to do the opposite of the ritual, you're going to get some funny reactions, right? Try to talk to the back of someone's head, for example, for a while, or just lay down on the middle of the ground while you're speaking to someone. And you'll realize that human relationships are extremely ritualized, right? We speak and we feel the tension, right? It's really like a rubber band. You speak, and then you have to stop speaking, and you have to listen. And so there's this kind of wave, this back and forth wave, this call and response, you could call it, that happens in a conversation, that if you don't follow that pattern, you're going to break the relationship, and no one's going to want to talk to you anymore. And everybody knows someone like that. And everybody sometimes has fallen into that excess where they've talked too much and they realize it, or they haven't talked enough. They just listened and didn't give their opinion, and the other person feels like you weren't there. So we can see that this is how it works. Now, you can scale this pattern up from simple human interactions, from simple human engagements with objects, into social interactions as well. That is, we realize that in order to have teleology, in order to have purpose, and in order for a group to have purpose, it has to encounter itself ritually. It has to have things which bind it together, which make the group recognize that it is together. Because this is the problem of multiplicity, and the problem of complexity happens especially in terms of human interactions. What's the difference between a group and a crowd? What's the difference between a team and a crowd, right? There are a bunch of people that are together, but one of them is not bound teleologically and the other is, right? A team is bound teleologically. Let's say a soccer team. They are bound towards a purpose. They're bound towards a common identity. And that common identity will manifest itself in ritual. And those rituals include the rules of the game, the rules of engagement. Those rituals also includes other things which are more related to identity. And this is something which will bring us straight into religious ritual. That is, those rituals include the capacity to attend to the thing that binds us together. And this is when we're going to start to realize that this pattern is almost first and foremost a pattern of attention, or the manner in which we're capable of paying attention. And so a team will have to attend to those things that bind them together. And what that will look like will be something like celebration. You know, at the fear of sounding somewhat scandalous to people, it's going to look something like worship, like a little worship, right? It's going to be a celebration of the thing which binds us together, reverence towards the thing that binds us together. I don't want to, I use the word worship to scandalize you a little bit, but like reverence is fine, right? And so they will have to reverence their team colors. They have to reverence their team name. They have to have a totem, a mascot, which will represent them in with the mythological frame as a kind of an animal or some figure that has more social connotation that will bind their identity together. And then they will also be bound, you'd say, on the human level through a person who will represent their ideal, the team captain, the coach at different levels in this kind of hierarchy of being. And so you will see that a sports team, but not a sports team, a knitting group or anything that is bound together will necessarily have to have these elements at different levels of reality. Now, one of the aspects is that it will also have to judge what is inside and what is outside. And what will be the judge of that inside and outside will be their reason for existing, right? And so you could say the logos, to use a Christian term, the logos of the group will be that which binds together, which joins the body into one, but will also be that which judges those that are inside to bind them, but also to exclude them. And so think of a knitting group, for example, right? You have a knitting group, a bunch of people come together, they knit together. That's what they do. And so there's a ritualized reality to that, which is that when they meet, they're going to knit. Now, as they're knitting, they'll probably do other things as well. Well, they'll talk, they'll chat, they'll talk about their lives. They might, someone might bring something to eat. And this is all going to kind of organically participate in the knitting group. But let's say that at some point, someone comes and says, well, I like this knitting group. I like to be with this knitting group, but I don't want to knit. I want to play music. And so they're like, okay, well, maybe one person playing music while we're knitting is not a big deal. And so, they play music. And then that person invites someone else and says, oh, I like this knitting group, but this music playing is pretty cool. So what if I brought my instrument and then we start playing music? And so imagine now that process going on to a point where, well, okay, are we a knitting group? Or are we a band? Like, what's going on? We have to decide. We have to judge. Either we exclude these musicians or exclude their practice, or we cease being what we are. We die, basically. This knitting group is going to cease to exist. It's going to be transformed into something else. Okay. And so this is how kind of this pattern acts as the attention that we give towards the teleology of the group will also act. The logos of that, the reason, the purpose that I'm looking at will look like a binding agent, but will also look like a judge. And so, like I said, this is how all kind of reality works, or all of how reality lays itself out. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of show you that this pattern that I'm talking about is really just, it is a cosmological argument. It's an argument about how reality works. And what it does is that it argues about how reality works based on the notion that intelligence is necessary for reality to unfold. And so this is something which is kind of bubbling up, right? It's not something which is that everybody agrees with in the world, but it's something which is bubbling up, and we're seeing appear in different fields. As even in science, we're finding some physicists who are arguing what they call the strong anthropic principle, which is that consciousness or intelligence is necessary for the world to unfold, because intelligence is the only thing which is able to discern pattern. And not just discern, but it's not just a discernment, it's a participation in pattern, right? Because the agent, the pattern ends up coagulating in the agent, you could say. And so the conscious being sees these patterns, but also engages with these patterns and transforms these patterns. It's not just a passive, it's not just a passive relationship to the world, right? It's an active, embodied relationship to the world. Okay, now, before we go on the example, I want to say that once you kind of enter into this way of thinking, it has certain consequences, right? And one of the consequences is that the intelligent perception, the perception of the embodied intelligence, becomes the primary mode of engagement and interpretation in the world. And when I'm saying this is extremely important, because we tend to abstract and become scientists. And we think that that is the primary way to interpret reality, right? And we do it. We all do it. We analyze. We're analysts. We look at the patterns from outside, right? We try to stand above and say, well, look at that interesting pattern in that culture, and look at that interesting pattern in that culture, and look at how nice it is that they're the same. And we're kind of like these disembodied beings that are just looking at the world supposedly. But once you realize this notion that intelligence is necessary, and this ritualized embodied reality is necessary for the world to appear, then it changes everything. Because you have to embody. The real way to engage the world is the embodied way. So it's not that we're standing above the stories and we're interpreting the stories. It's not that we're standing above the images and we're interpreting the images. We are in a story. We participate in a story. We participate in communities. We participate in images, right? They are our communities. They are our images. They are the things that make us exist, right? As we kind of actively engage with them. And so that's why if you look at the way that, when David at the beginning said that Jonathan is an artist, this is extremely important in my theory about reality, is that it's like I'm presenting it to you in a way in the theory, but this presentation that I'm giving you, this is secondary to what is really going on. What is really going on is that to the extent that I'm capable of, I get up in the morning and I physically carve sacred images, right? I go to church on Sunday and I physically participate in the rituals and the liturgy. I sit there with my family around the table and I eat a meal, and I realize that this meal is a smaller version of the ritual that I'm engaging in on Sunday morning with my parish. And so it's an embodied reality. It's an embodied engagement with the world. And so like I said, it's a pretty radical. It's very radical. Sometimes people don't realize how radical the proposition I'm making is. The proposition I'm making is that if what the things I said are true, that means that the only way for them to be fully true is for us to dive in and embody, while realizing, of course, and while being aware of all the problems that come with this pattern as well. There are many problems that come with this pattern, because I said, right, one of the issues of the reality of being engaged in a group that has a teleology, that has a purpose, is that it excludes. That's the very nature of a group. A group excludes. Groups always exclude. That's why they're a group, because they're not the totality of all manifestation in the universe. They necessarily need to exclude. Even if you want to be inclusive in the kind of, let's say, politically correct way, you're still going to exclude animals from your group, or you're still going to exclude rocks from your group. You necessarily have to exclude, because you're not God, right? You're not the totality of everything. In order to kind of move teleologically in the world, you have to exclude. And so that has difficulty to it. And so, but there are ways to kind of, let's say, to deal with those in a manner which won't make the group completely self-devouring, and also won't make you kind of fall into the chaos of thinking that nothing has identity and everything is just a mush of potential, let's say. Okay, so hopefully if that's clear, what I want to do is I'm going to go into the first chapter of Genesis and show you how the creation narrative, it's a very, very wide story. It's a huge narrative. Obviously, I can't exhaust it, but I want to show you is that the manner in which it shows that the world manifests itself through intelligence, through consciousness, and that this is actually the agent of how reality comes together, and how we participate in that as intelligent beings, okay? And so hopefully you are a little aware. I will go through the verses, but I hope everybody's a little bit aware of the creation narrative in Genesis, enough that you'll be able to at least follow. All right, so here we go. Okay. So scripture starts, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So what we have are first a setup of one thing which seems to be outside of the system, but is related actually to the top of the system. So you have God, who is in the beginning. The beginning can be interpreted as the head. The actual word means the head of something. It also means something like the principle, right? Or the origin. All of these words work into in the beginning. And so God is in the beginning, and he separates heaven and earth. And the characteristics he gives of heaven and earth is that, because he says that the Spirit was hovering above the water. Now we have to see the Spirit hovering above the waters as a repetition. You'll see it's all going to be repetition and showing you what the pattern is. And so the Spirit hovering above the water is the same as heaven. Heaven is just wind, right? We have to be immediate about this. Heaven are the things that you can't see, like wind you can't see, like your breath you can't see, like speech you can't see. All of these things are things that you can't see. And then, so it separates heaven and earth, two basic principles of reality. The earth is void, it's empty, it's silence, it's water, and heaven is spirit, wind, breath, and speech. So at first, we basically just have two categories, right? The implications of these two categories are not going to be clear right away. They're going to start to manifest themselves, but you can already understand it as something like spirit and potential, or actuality and potential is actually totally fine to see it that way. Dante completely joins together the Aristotelian categories of actuality and potential, and in the creation narrative, the idea of heaven and earth as these two basic principles. And so this is just this, right? It's no different. It's a universal category. It's there in every culture that exists, this idea of this basic separation of heaven and earth. And it is completely based on our actual experience in the world. And if you can't kind of re-embody yourself and realize that this distinction is a very simple and clear one, you're going to struggle to understand what the meaning of it can be. Because as you're standing there, like imagine yourself standing there on the ground, right? All light comes from above, right? Wind comes from above. The things that are above are unreachable. You can't touch the stars. You can't touch the sky. You can't touch the sun and the moon. All of these things which give you light and which are the source of wind, invisible movement. Think about it that way. Think of wind as invisible movement, as invisible patterns of transformation. Okay, think of it that way. So you have all of this above you, and then below, you have a world that you knock your foot against. You have a world that you can touch, that you can count, that you can get dirty with, that can kill you, and that is also dark, right? It hides the sun. If you take something that's on the ground, you take a rock and you put it above your head, it's going to hide the light from you, right? This is very embodied, right? This is very, very. But what it does is it separates two basic categories of reality. And so when God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was an evening, and there was a morning, the first day. So now it starts to become clear. You can easily understand, of course, if you can embody yourself, that light has to do with heaven, has to do with spirit, it's above, and then darkness has something to do with this void. So you don't necessarily have to represent it below, but it becomes analogous to below because it's the moment when the light stops. It's the moment where the light stops showing you what the world is like. So I'm placing it like this for you to understand. You wouldn't necessarily have to put night at the bottom, but this is a good way to kind of see light, dark, earth as void and empty, and heaven as wind, spirit, breath, and speech. So God, so God is above and he speaks and light comes down on the world. So then God says, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And so it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was an evening and there was a morning the second day. All right. So already you're starting to see something like a narrowing. You have heaven above, but now you have like a second heaven, which is like, okay, what's going on? You have the water that is below, it's kind of split in two. The potentiality, the earth that is below, it's kind of opened up. And now we have a pattern which is similar, which is setting itself up inside the world. So you're going to start to see that this pattern of attention is fractal, just like the way in which multiplicity moves into unity in any object in the world or in any community in the world happens at every level of reality. And this is what is going to start to appear to you, is that the pattern is just repeating itself at different levels until it comes together in the middle, okay? And so we have these waters being separated, and then we have now a secondary heaven, another heaven, which is also above, but is something like inside the earth. The earth now is obviously not the earth exactly the way that we understand it, but it's inside the things that are visible and are quantifiable. Now, Augustine said this clearly. He said everything you see, and when you look up in the sky, all the things you see, the sun, the cloud, the stars, all of this is the earth. All of this because it can be quantified, but the second heaven, those things above that actually can be seen and identified, they are like a secondary heaven. They are pointers towards something which is truly invisible, we could say, or patterns that are truly invisible. So it's not. I don't want you to think that I'm being all esoteric here, right? It's like the world has a pattern. Let's say day and night. That's a pattern, and the thing that manifests that to you, that you can recognize that it is a pattern, is those shining lights up in the sky that move. Right? These shining lights up in the sky, they move, and they reveal to you a regular pattern. The regular patterns of reality are in the sky. The more embodied irregular patterns are in the world. They're still there, but they're more irregular. But the ones in the heavens are regular, right? Every day the sun comes up. Every day the sun goes down. The moon has its phases. The stars move in the sky. And so it's completely natural that these heavenly bodies are pointers to patterns. They point us to patterns. They point us to the invisible patterns, you could say, even though they are obviously visible. Okay. So God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let the dry ground appear. And it was so. So God called the dry ground land, and gathered the water, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Now, I want to point to you here something that I haven't pointed to yet before. So now think of the problem of intelligence that I'm trying to present to you, and this kind of embodied or active participation in the way that reality manifests itself to you teleologically. So God says, and you can imagine it like God says is God shining light. Okay. So imagine an eye in the sky, and that a sun, an eye, the sun is the same thing as an eye, let's say. And this is shining light down on the world and is showing you things. And that has to do with identifying. So when you encounter something that you've never seen before and you see it, what is it that you want to do? You want to identify it. That's your job. Your job is to identify it. If you don't identify it, you don't know if it can kill you. You don't know if it's dangerous. You have no idea. And so there's a direct relationship between seeing, speaking in the sense of identifying, naming, you could say. Okay. And so God speaks, identifies as light comes down from heaven, manifests itself on the thing. And then God speaks it into being. But then he sees its relevance. He recognizes that which is manifesting itself to him, and he says that it's good. He judges it right away. God judges. Now, think again of your experience. Think of your just basic experience, right? You walk into the room, you see the glass, you identify it, and immediately you ask yourself, consciously or unconsciously, you're always asking yourself if it's good. This is necessary because the reason why you even perceive the glass in the first place is because you use it to drink water. And so you always have to ask yourself if it's good or not. Is it a good glass? And this is true about everything that you encounter. You don't even do it consciously. This is true of everything you encounter. As you're walking on the grass, you have a system which is constantly judging because it has to be able to recognize if there's a hole. It has to be able to recognize if there's an object in your way. And so it's looking at the ground, at the grass that you're walking on or the path, and it's always identifying, naming, and recognizing whether it's good. So hopefully this makes sense. All right. So now we're really going to start to see this fractal pattern start to appear more clearly. So you have the basic structure. You have the very invisible patterns of head, principle, origin, wind, spirit, breath, speech, which is completely above. And now you have the void, empty, silent, question, puzzle, darkness, potential. All of this is below. And now at every level of reality, this is going to start to appear as being the same pattern. And so, like I said, the potential and the actuality of the glass is relative, obviously. But it points to the pattern itself, to the pattern of identity and potentiality itself. And so this is why you're going to see at every level, it's going to repeat. So you have the secondary heavens, which are the sky, and then you have the secondary earth. And now in the secondary earth, the same pattern happens again. So God creates dry ground and separates it from the waters. So dry ground is above, it's higher than water, right? This is just basic experience. Dry ground is higher than water. Dry ground is the place where you live. Dry ground is the place where you find meaning, because that's where you build cities. That's where you do things. That's where you eat. All of this is from the dry ground. That's where you can breathe air. You can encounter spirit from the dry ground and light, but you can't in the sea, right? In the sea, if you stay there too long, you die because you run out of spirit. You run out of meaning. You run out of air. All of these analogies play themselves out. So imagine dry ground as a mountain is the best way to understand it. You have this mountain, and then at the bottom of the mountain or around the mountain, you have the sea, which is an image of the original chaos, the original potentiality, now at a different level. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to the various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seeds according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in accordance to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was an evening and there was a morning the third day. Now here, notice again what is going on, right? So God says, let the land produce vegetation, but not just produce vegetation. What is he saying? He's saying produce seed-bearing plants. Why seed-bearing plants? What a strange thing to say. He's saying seed-bearing plants because once again, in this pattern now, the seed is the identity and the vegetation is the variation or is the bottom part of this pattern. So he's repeating the pattern. He's saying, you need a way for this identity to recognize the identity of the plant. That's the seed. The seed is the manner in which you recognize the identity of what you're encountering. So you want reality to have stability. This is how we work in the world. We have to be able to recognize the different plants. And in that pattern, what there is there's both identity and variability. So we're moving towards a kind of multiplication, but this multiplication always has to be a recognition also of the identity of each plant and how these plants are different from each other, and how they participate in a major pattern of just plants. So you can see this fractal process just kind of continuing. And then once again, the same thing, God says, the identity is in the God said, it's in the seed of the plants, and then the plants kind of manifest as variability. God sees and judges and says that it is good. So now you can see, same thing, the dry ground. On the dry ground, you have the same pattern of above and below, right? Identity, spirit. Obviously, it's not spirit in this case, but identity and variability, all right? So we continue. So God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was an evening, and there was a morning, the fourth day. So now in the heaven, even in the world of meaning, the same pattern appears. So the pattern appears below in kind of the world of manifestation, you could say, as a fractal pattern, but it also appears above in the pattern itself. And so we have these signs in the sky. They are signs to mark the days. They're signs for you to identify the pattern of reality. And there's one of the major lights, which is there to govern the day and one to govern the night. So you have light and dark, even in the heavens. The pattern is fractal all the way through. Right? Every day is going to be like that. Just spoiler here. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea monsters. It doesn't say, they don't like to say sea monsters, but great creatures of the sea means sea serpents and sea monsters. All these demythologizing biblicists are the worst. It means sea monsters. God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas, and that the birds increase on the earth. There was an evening and there was a morning, the fifth day. Now, this is where you're going to start to see what's really going on. Because until now, you might have thought that what I'm saying is just a bunch of just random interpretation. But here it becomes impossible not to see. Why on earth would God create birds and fish on the same day? What is happening? It's the strangest thing in the world, it seems to us. Doesn't make any sense, right? Well, it only makes sense if we understand that he's constantly establishing the repetition of the heaven and earth pattern, of the above and below pattern, which is started from the beginning. And so he creates the birds above and the sea monsters below and the fish. So even in the sea, he separates fish and sea monsters. The fish are those that you can eat, that you can encounter, and the sea monsters are those that are going to eat you, right? There's a difference between the two. So you have the fish and the sea monsters, but even in this whole pattern, you have the birds and the fish as framing again the same duality, which is being framed from the very beginning of the text. And you have to understand that that's what's been going on from the beginning. Because why would God create vegetation before he created the sun and the moon? It doesn't make any sense in terms of science. How can you create vegetation first and then create the sun? It's completely illogical in terms of a scientist, but in terms of a pattern of reality, it's completely understandable. And what you'll notice is that from the beginning of this whole thing, the bottom stuff appears first. The potentiality kind of manifests itself first as a question, as this kind of darkness which is calling to be solved, this potential which is asking to be resolved. And then comes the answer from above, right? The name, the idea, the light. So think again about your experience, right? You encounter something in the world. You can imagine in a microsecond, microsecond, the first thing it does is present itself to you as potential or as puzzle. And then obviously it happens almost simultaneously. You immediately identify, judge, and make it participate in reality. But you can obviously have the experience of seeing something you've never seen before. I mean, everybody's had that experience. You see something or you experience something that you've never seen before. So at first it presents itself to you as a puzzle, right? It's like, what is this? And then the process has to happen, this back and forth process of question and identification, of question and judging, in order for you to finally be able to kind of identify and participate in its existence. All right. And so now we have, God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And so once again, what is happening? What is happening in this text? Why is it that God separates living creatures between livestock, wild animals, and creatures that move on the ground? And the answer is very simple. It's just to continue the very same pattern. This hierarchy that we're seeing is a hierarchy of meaning, right? It's a hierarchy of identification, participation in reality. And so when God creates the animals, he does it in the same pattern. That is, you have livestock. Livestock is more intelligent animals. You can call them animals that are closer to us. Animals that participate in our intelligence. They are the sheep, the cows, all the animals that kind of, let's say, are not almost, but are more like extensions of human society. And then you have the wild animals, which are out there in the chaos, in the wild, in the world that doesn't completely make sense to us. And now then the creepy crawlers are the ones that live underground, like the sea monsters live underground, or that dig holes in the ground, that come up, and that are not completely in the light, you could say, that they're actually hiding in darkness, hiding under rocks. And so you have to kind of dig in order to encounter them, just like the sea monsters are and the fish are underground, just like the very pattern from the beginning of darkness, chaos, at the bottom, and light, meaning participation at the top. And then, of course, now we come to man. Again, then God said, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So why is it that man has to rule? This is like the most politically incorrect thing that you could say, right? What are we talking about? But once you realize this pattern, the pattern of intelligence, it has to change the way you see reality, which is that intelligence is the place in which reality is encountered, identified, and also judged. And this is going to be a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow. But at least try to understand it. Try to understand it in this pattern. So man has to rule because man is an image of God. Man is an image of God in the sense that man is a locus of intelligence. And all the things that God said, all the things that you saw from the beginning in terms of how God creates the world, is something that we participate in at a lower level, we could say. We recognize that we participate in that at a lower level because we do that. We cast light, we identify, we judge, and then and then we are the place in which meaning is gathered into us. And so now God puts man above all the creatures which are below. Now, remember, those creatures were already organized in this hierarchy of meaning, right? Livestock, wild animals, crawlers, fish, sea monsters, all of this is organized in this kind of hierarchy of meaning, this hierarchy of danger, this hierarchy between that which is in the light, which is identifiable, which participates in intelligence, and that which is below and is in the chaos and is also dangerous to you. Okay. And so we have the human person meeting in the middle, becoming the place where all of these patterns kind of join together in the center. And so then to understand the role of man a little better, we actually have to go into Genesis 2 just for a little bit to kind of understand, because in Genesis 2, there's another creation narrative which focuses more on the human person. And then it says God, sorry, let me skip this actually. Oh yeah, so it says that I don't want to run out of time here. But he says, God blessed them and said, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Again, this is going to be difficult, but intelligence fills the earth and subdues it. Not in a negative sense, but in the sense of identifying, right? The scientist that is constantly discovering new species and all of this is something like intelligence or man filling the earth and subduing it in the sense of identifying it and making it participate in a pattern of meaning. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moved in the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant, et cetera, et cetera. And then he saw that it was good. And it's important that when God created the humans, he creates them male and female. And in scripture, there's a sense in which at first this is almost like man is actually androgynous, that he creates man, male and female. That is, in man is the duality of heaven and earth itself, right? So there's a microcosm of this basic duality of heaven and earth, which is being reproduced inside the human person, as within them, they also contain this actuality and potentiality, and how they also participate in the manner in which actuality and potentiality come together in the world. So it's not just in them, but it's actually in as being intelligent subjects, they are able to now encounter the world as this union of these two. All right, so this is where I wanted to go into the second chapter of Genesis just for a little bit to help you understand how this kind of comes together. So it says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now, no shrub had yet appeared on the earth. Now, you see, it's different here. Here, there's a sense in which actually man kind of comes before everything. He's actually there at the outset. Before God did all those other things before, you can imagine that God was man, or the microcosm, or the intelligent agent, was there even in the origin of creation itself. No shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had sprung up. For the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So it's a similar image as to what we have before. But here, man is there right at the outset. So it says that there was no plant, there was nothing on the ground, and that water covered the earth. Water came out from the earth and covered the earth. So it's the same image as before. You have heaven above and the earth below. The earth is chaos and water. And then what God does is he gathers all the potentiality, the dust, all this formless chaos. He gathers it into one place, and then he puts heaven into it. He blows air into this gathered dust, and that's how man becomes a living being. Now, what I want to propose to you is that process of gathering dust and putting air into it. That's what was being described in the first chapter of Genesis. And that is how you encounter everything in reality all the time, non-stop. That is, the world presents itself to you as indefinite potential. And the manner in which you are able to exist in a living world is that intelligence gathers potential into bodies and then puts purpose or recognizes purpose, engages with purpose, meaning, spirit, breath. And that is how the world actually exists, right? And so the description in Genesis is a description of how the world exists, not in a scientific way, but in a way which takes into account that intelligence is necessary, that we are intelligent beings in the world, and that we can't avoid that problem. We can't pretend that we're not in the world and that we're just analyzing phenomena and that we're not part of that process, right? So it's a cosmic vision of reality, which includes the viewer, which measures the viewer, or includes the viewer in the way in which we understand the world. All right, and so we have this image again. Now, we can represent it this way, but we can also represent it this way. This is a way that will help you understand. If you can realize that you can represent it this way, you're going to understand so much. And this is where I want to make a shameless plug, which is that my brother, Mathieu Pageau, and we developed a lot of this way of speaking about reality together, which is not something that we invented. It really is just a reinterpretation of traditional pattern making. It's an interpretation of the church fathers, of the rabbis, of the Brahmin. It's just a way in which we are trying to represent these traditional stories for the modern world. He wrote a book called The Language of Creation, which goes through a lot of the things that I'm talking about in a more kind of mathematical, technical way. So now think of this, the first image that I showed you as heaven and earth, you could say. So this is the same. So at the top, you have, I'm just lay them out there. Like there's more complexity to this, but it's like Father, heaven, spirit, light, essence, pattern, mind, purpose, all of these things which are above. And then at the bottom, mother, earth, waters, chaos, potential, question, body, puzzle, multiplication, all of these images of that which is below. And then what you have is the pattern which descends, right? The ray of light, the speech, the speaking which comes down, right? The logos which comes down from the Father and connects with heaven, right? Connects with earth. And that usually in all traditions pretty much appears at the top of a mountain, which is just completely intuitive, right? The mountain is the place where heaven and earth meet. It's like the earth kind of coming together into a point where the heaven now touches the earth at its highest point, okay? But it's also an image of this difference between quality and quantity, identity, variability, all of this kind of image of the relationship between the identity of your team and the variability of its players, of its idiosyncrasies. All of that will kind of come down below as this image of the mountain or the pyramid. And so I won't go into this right now, but there's a centrifugal force and a centripetal force. That is, there is a capacity to move into attention, to move into identity, to move into purpose. And then there's a way in which we are able to kind of have this, let's say, what you could call a breakdown of attention or focused attention, but is also this kind of general attention, you could call it, where we have this general attention on the borders of our visual field, where it's like almost like an alarm system, right? Where we don't have a lot of energy there, but if things pop in, this variability kind of pops in on the edge, and it's the question, right? The puzzle, something's happening here, and I can't see it. It's a puzzle. So what do? I then put my attention on it, identify it, judge it, and do all the things that we talked about before. And so there's a centrifugal force and a centripetal force, and that's true as much as in your attention as it is in a team or a country or any group, anything that has body. There's something which is making it more towards its identity, and some aspect which is pushing it towards multiplicity, variability, and potentiality. Okay, I don't want to go into that too much because that would take us into a whole other world. But just to understand that, you probably are, if you're Jungians, you're aware of the kind of coagula-solve structure that Jung used in terms of alchemy. This is exactly what I'm talking about, right? This is exactly the coagula-solve pattern, which is a movement towards solidity and identity, and then a dispersion into potentiality. But what I want to help you to understand, especially, is that this structure, like this basic pattern, can help you understand so many things, right? It's the pattern of a temple, right? It's a pattern of a temple where in a temple, let's say in the Jewish temple, you had the Holy of Holies, where the glory of God would descend in the Holy of Holies. And then there you would have a priest who was just one person. And then outside of that, you would have all these levels of quantification, where outside you would have the priestly caste, then you would have the faithful, and then you would have the strangers, right? It's the pattern of a church, which has the same pattern. You have the altar in the highest point of the church, where God descends on the altar. And then there's also a reduced amount of people that are there that represent this moving into quality, this moving away from quantity. And then the sacraments get dispersed out into the nave where the faithful gather. And then there's a narthex, or a vestibule, where strangers come. And then on the outside of the church, there are gargoyles and strangers and other aspects of reality. Okay. So this is the structure of the way that Greeks understood themselves in ancient times, right? They had the omphalos, they had the navel of the world. And in that place, they received oracles from heaven, which would bind them together, which would manifest their destiny. All of that was manifested at the place where they had the belly button of the world, the center of the world. And then as you moved away, you would have Greeks, and then strangers that you knew, and then finally barbarians, and ultimately monsters, things that have confused identities, things that you don't recognize, would be outside on the outer edges of this. Okay. So like I said, this is basically just the pattern of the way in which we encounter the world, but it's also the pattern of how societies actually bind together. It's not just a subjective experience, but it scales up in terms of your experience into the social experience, and ultimately, I think, into a cosmic version. It's an image of the cosmic pattern. So I just want to show you quickly, without even going into detail, I want to show you how this pattern just appears everywhere. So here's an icon of the Ascension of Christ. Look, you have above, you have the top of the pyramid, or the top of the mountain. You have the principle, the logos, which is above. You can imagine that the Father is actually above this, hidden above. And then below, you have the Mother as the place of potentiality. And then next to her, you have all this multiplicity. So you have the one, you have the Mother, you have the 12. Okay, this is one example. Here's an example of the image of baptism. So you have Christ as the one who now joins heaven and earth, as this point at the top of the mountain that joins heaven and earth, but now he's descending all the way down from the top, let's say, down into the waters of chaos. And you see the Spirit above, which is coming down on the top of the mountain. And below you have the sea monsters, which are below in the chaos of the waters, right? Symbol, just many, many. And so this is a version that I made, which I call the image of everything, basically. And it's just trying to kind of capture the Bible story as an image of this pattern, as an image of how the top of the pattern relates to the bottom of the pattern, the waters at the bottom, the sin, the fall, the thorns as this multiplicity, et cetera, the sea monster. I don't want to interpret it, but there are different ways in which you can kind of see this. And the last one I wanted to show you is an image of the Last Judgment, which is really the ultimate image of this, if you want to see an ultimate image of this whole pattern, because obviously the Last Judgment being the last moment, or the eschaton, or the moment in which all of totality is manifested in one final thing, then you have this image of the world. In this version, especially, you actually have the Father above, right at the top. Can you? I don't think you can see my cursor, huh? Can you see my cursor? Oh, here, you can see it this way. Okay, so you have the Father above here. Then you have the Logos descending onto the world. Can you see that he's got the world underneath him? And then you have that which is below, which is both the hell, this kind of monstrous hell, okay? But it's also the place of paradise here, because it's the place in which we gather things together. So remember in Scripture, the gathering of the dust and the blowing of the Spirit. Well, that also happens from the bottom, right? So you have the two sides. Remember, I talked about the centrifugal and the centripetal force. On the left of Christ is the sword, and there's a descent down into death. On the right of Christ, there is his hand lifting up, right? Lifting up. And here you find the gathering of the saints, and they rise up. See these little saints with wings? They go up on the right of Christ into glory. So there are very, very mysterious things about this image that I don't want to go into too much detail. But you can understand that this is happening through these angels that are making music, that are making sounds, pattern sounds, and this is what is calling to the end, bringing about the judgment of all of reality, in which all of this is kind of happening. The judging of the good, bringing into the center, and the ultimate exclusion in a cosmic way towards death. And then here, this is the process. So this is it's a complicated thing in Orthodox theology. But on this is the soul, which is, you can see the soul here. The soul is moving up this serpent/ladder. So it's both a way to go down and a way to go up, just like Chutes and Ladders, guys. Chutes and Ladders is one of the oldest games in reality. It's a truly cosmic game, by the way. It's almost religious as a game. So you have this coming down and moving up, which is captured in one image. And on this are all the sins that you can have. Those sins are coupled with virtues. And so as the soul ascends this thing, they encounter at every level of reality a demon, which is pulling it down, but they also encounter angels, which are pulling them up. Here in this one, you don't see the angels so much. In other versions, you'll see the angel. Like in this one, you see the angel as the one trying to push down the demon. And as you move up, you kind of move towards this judgment. And that's actually that hierarchy that I showed you at the beginning in the creation. That also obviously has an analogous version of that in you, in your virtues, in your capacity to scatter yourself into chaos, right? By falling into all these thoughts that rip you apart, and the capacity to join together into one and to move up the ladder of attention as you worship God, of attention as you move towards virtue, rather than this dilapidation and distraction by which you lose the worship, you lose the capacity to attend to that which is above you, and you fall into chaos and the multiplicity of the passions, right? Passions that rip you apart. All right, Jordan, I think we're starting with your questions. Let's go for it.
Well, how about subdue? Think of the word sub, to arrange hierarchically, due, to give everything its due. That is, so when man subdues the world, he does exactly what you're doing. Right? Everything in its place. And that's a reflection of the simultaneous act of perception and judgment, and the fact that those things, as you pointed out, are inextricable. And that's technically true, right?
Yeah.
Psychologists studying perception from the biological ground have drawn that inescapable conclusion. So that was really cool. Ritual encounters with other people. In Dostoevsky's The Devils, the Possessed, there's a great scene where Stavrogan goes into an officers' club, and he's coming unglued at this point in his political chaos, utopian political chaos. He's possessed by these ideas. He puts his fingers in the nostrils of an aged general and drags him onto the street, and it just causes absolute chaos in the entire society. So
you realize how fragile, like how easy it is to actually just shatter, this ritual reality.
Yes, Dostoevsky understood that so deeply. So that's stunning. The female potential equation, I've been criticized a lot for associating femininity with chaos, although it's not an insult, and it's not something that I did casually, and it's not something I did. And the idea of the seminal word is precisely a reflection of that. And the implication of that is feminine potentiality, and the analog between the word and the drawing out of potential new forms. So there's a sexual element to that, obviously, that's reflected in the idea of the seminal word. The pyramid notion, on top of that George Washington Tower, the obelisk, is a pyramid capped in aluminum, of all things, because aluminum was the most valuable metal at that point. And so that idea that there's a pure and valuable top to the pyramidal structure, that's an icon of the entire structure of the United States, and by extension, the entire, let's say, Western world, but world as such.
Yeah, the Egyptian pyramids were most probably capped with gold. Like the very top of the pyramid would be like a mini pyramid, and then that would have been gilded.
Right. So one of the advantages to this interpretive framework, is that it explains the intrinsic sacred nature of the pyramidal structure. It's a great mystery. Like, what's up with these pyramids? Exactly. And like, people put a lot of work into those things. So it wasn't trivial.
Yeah. And the ziggurats are pyramids too. People always want to separate them, but all these structures, these structures that are representing mountains are like geometric versions of mountains. That's what they are. And if once you understand that, then you realize that every time someone goes up a mountain in scripture, it's the same as a pyramid. It's going up to the top of reality.
Well, I think you did a brilliant job of explaining that with your analysis of those images at the end. Are you going to make that image you made into a carving?
Yes, I am, but it just in line somewhere in one of my carvings. Someone has commissioned.
You need a client to purchase that?
I have one, but I can also make one for you if you want.
It's quite something, Jonathan. And then this last thing I'll say, I think, is in the second creation version, where you have man primary, that's a analog, a repetition of the notion of the word.
Yeah.
So it's the same. So that's so interesting, seeing that embedded in a really archaic narrative there. Oh, so I do have one other thing. Why did you use intelligence as the primary descriptor of the interactive consciousness instead of logos?
Well, the reason why, I tried to kind of move between the two. It's also because it's hard to know which word to use, because the way that the ancients understood intelligence was a little different from the way we understand it. It was more, it's called a nous in Orthodox thinking, which is, it's beyond rationality. It's the capacity to directly grasp the pattern. Right.
That's closer to attention.
Exactly. That's why it's related to attention.
Yeah. That supersedes rationality is embedded inside that capacity to pay attention, because attention selects the objects that rationality deals with, and rationality tends not to notice that. It's like, well, that's the easy part. It's like, no, that's the hard part, actually.
Yeah, and as we see, like YouTube virality is a great way to understand what happens when we're not careful about that. Because what we have with YouTube virality or just internet virality are just these random, stupid things that pop up, gather all the attention, vanish, pop up, gather all the attention, vanish. And so it's actually ends up being a form of breakdown of attention. It's a distraction. It prevents us from seeing, it's the incapacity to pay attention to the right things, and it leads us into a kind of breakdown.
It was great. I always learn a lot listening to you. It's really good.
Jordan.
Really good. Thanks.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Okay, one question someone is asking, could you elaborate on what you mean about above and below?
Well, the idea of above and below, it, like I said, it manifests itself fractally, but it's about something like, I mean, it's actual and potential. And so it's identity and potentiality. And so think about it. Let's think about it just like let's bring it down to like a real like a basic level. So let's think of a sports team again, right? So you have the identity of the sports team, the reason why it exists, which is to win basketball games or to do that. Then there's the identity of the team itself, which is kind of embedded in that. And then there's the potential. The potential of that team are the players. Those players have also their own potential. Like it's like I said, it's fractal. So the players can change, but the identity of the team won't. So that's what we mean by potential, right? And so it's variability, which comes together and then is able to manifest the purpose in the world. So that's what we mean by above and below. And so God says, to let the earth bring forth vegetation that has seed. We always forget that God doesn't just speak it into existence. He says to the earth, bring forth. Right? And so it's like out of the potential comes this variability, which then receives name from above and joins it together into specific identities. And so like I said, this idea of above and below can be seen in anything that you encounter.
Another question is, you mentioned the pattern of livestock and wild animals that manifest heaven and earth. Are people that try to tame animals such as tigers, bears, examples of breakdown of the pattern, and that is why usually it ends in disaster?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can see that you have to kind of have a respect, subdue, as Jordan said. I love that. I actually love that. That is, you have to be able to see things where they really are and engage with them where they are in this kind of pattern of reality. And so if you engage with the pattern of reality in a wrong way, you die. And it can be something like taming a tiger, but it can also be something like eating rocks. Like rocks are not potential that you have access to eat. And that's true for like an indefinite amount of things. That there are certain identities which have certain potentials that can participate in them. And if you don't encounter that properly, then you're not going to work. If you have a basketball team and you decide to fill the basketball team with gerbils, well, your basketball team is gonna lose. It's not going to exist. And so this is how it works. Like in terms of this idea of subduing, right, or judging is a very good thing. It's a necessary thing because it's how you judge what potential is able to join with what identity.
Okay, we have a heretical question. How sure are you about the universality of heaven and earth distinction? As far as I know, it is symbolic pattern appearing with the axial age cultures, Buddhism, Christianity, Socratic Greece, Islam. Animistic culture, for example, do not have clear distinction between those two categories. So by extension, what makes you sure that all of this isn't just a perfect exposition of an axial age mind?
How can I say this? Now I'm going to go back into what I'm saying. Which is about embodied reality. People who talk about the axial age and animistic as if they don't exist in the world, I have very little patience for that. Like, where are you? Where are you to tell me about the axial age as if it's something which you're not in, and talk about the animistic age as if it's something that somehow you can see from outside? Like this, how can I say this? It's like, we don't know much about animistic religions because we're not animistic religions. We're always interpreting animistic religions from the place where we are. And so to me, it's always strange. It's like, do you know the secret traditions of the shamans?
Mm-hmm.
Where you read the text that some European went out into Tibet and wrote some text based on what they encountered there. Were you initiated? right? Did they bring you into the secret of secrets? Did they tell you what their secret traditions are? No, they didn't. You don't know them. And so I'm not saying that the comet is true or false. I'm saying that you really know less about these traditions than you think you do. Because the way you know about something is not by studying it from the outside, but it's about encountering it and living it from the inside. And those that are initiated into the higher mysteries, they're not supposed to talk about it anyways. So they're not going to tell you. So even if a scholar was at some point maybe initiated into the higher mysteries, they shouldn't tell you. And if they tell you, it means they probably weren't initiated and they're bullshitting you. Right. This is true, like even of the Eleusinian mysteries. Everybody talks about the Eleusinian mysteries as if they know what they are. It's like that was a pretty awesome thing because no one ever told anybody what happened there.
Right.
And so it's really important to understand that, to understand this. Anyways, I'm sorry. I don't want to like go off on this person, but it's really just important to understand the implications of these embodied patterns and how it is that every time we pretend that we can stand above them and just analyze them, that I think we're deluding ourselves. And so coming back to heaven and earth, how can I say this? Like, I think that heaven and earth is a universal pattern. It doesn't mean that there maybe aren't other ways of explaining that same duality or that same relationship. And also it's the same thing. Like it's the same problem. Like these animistic, cultures that were there before the actual age, you don't know anything about them. You have no way of encountering them. And the ones you encounter now, the idea that they're the same as the ones that were there before the actual age is also, it's all kind of weird scientific delusions people give themselves. Sorry to whoever asked that question. I didn't mean to kind of go off, but these are sometimes these things I get itchy about them.
Okay, someone is asking, what is the meaning of the God calling the human very good versus calling the other things only good?
And it's super interesting because there's even a day where God doesn't say that it was good, by the way. People always forget that. When God separates the waters, he doesn't say that it was good. And so, I mean, I think that's what it is. It's that in a way, the human being participates in the pattern of the good in a way similar to the way God participates in the pattern of the good. That is, the human being can do good and can recognize good, right? And can participate in the good. Whereas the other beings, less so, not completely absent of it, but less so. And so I think that all living creatures participate in the good and participate in God ultimately, but it's just a question of hierarchy and embedded patterns, you could say.
There's a psychological observation in terms of psychological work, how out of the infinite complexity of interpretations, certain interpretations of experience have been offered to us to stay inside the group we accept defensively versus how we can seek out our intuited other patterns in our experience, create a new reality for ourselves.
Okay, I would say. Okay, let's say it this way: that the patterns of specific groups, they are always limited. They're limited by their limitation. They're limited by the fact that they embody the patterns in a specific context. So because they do so, they will always be somewhat faulty. They won't be perfect because they're not, right? They're somewhat lower on the mountain of meaning, you could say. And so, but ultimately, if you're attentive, the idea is that within those smaller patterns, you're able to intuit higher patterns. And hopefully participate in things which lead you into higher patterns. So if you're, let's give you an example. Like if you're part of a group of addicts, let's say, right? You hang out with a bunch of cokeheads or people who take heroin. So obviously there's something in that pattern which is true, right? There's something in that pattern which binds you together in a way towards the telos, towards the reason. But there's also something in that pattern which is leading you into a breakdown of yourself. But it still has something. And so hopefully that's something, right? That capacity to bind together with others in a kind of communion, that is ultimately what should lead you up towards a better version of that pattern, right? Towards, instead of hanging out with a bunch of cokeheads, right? You hang out with some people who play sports, or you hang out with people who are interested in cars, or people who are interested in this. But there is a way in which even in the lowest versions of these, there's always something for it to even exist that has to kind of participate. Now, I would be wary about the danger of thinking, the danger of seeing novelty as a value in itself, because this is something which we've seen very, very much in the modern world, which is we value novelty as novelty is neutral, right? Some novelties are good and some novelties are bad. And so we shouldn't seek out new patterns just because they're new. If we seek new patterns or better patterns, it's because they're better in the sense that they bring us closer to something which is a healthy mixture of this, a healthy balance of the patterning and the multiplicity, right? It's this incarnational principle. If you're not careful, it's true, you can move too high and go into tyrannical systems. If you move too low, then you fall into kind of anarchic, chaotic realities.
Someone is commenting that your proposition at the beginning of the talk that intelligence is necessary for the world to unfold reminds them of Jung recounting in Memory Dreams Reflection, standing over an African vista and having the feeling he's the first consciousness to ever have witnessed such a thing.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, there's an aspect of potential or encountering the strange, which is very important, because there's an aspect of surprise and wonder which comes with encountering that which we don't know, which is also part of the pattern of reality. And so there's an idea, right, in ancient stories that there are treasures hidden in the deep, right? That there are treasures hidden in the outside. There are treasures being guarded by monsters. And so there's a sense in which moving out into potentiality is also a way in which to kind of discover these pearls, right? These secrets, these precious stones, these gems that are kind of hidden in the unknown. So that's definitely part of the pattern as well.
Yeah, I think we have another question by Jordan.
Go ahead. Actually, it's a question from Tammy, so I'll let her ask it.
How did Darwin bring Plato back?
Because by coming back into the world of biology, he inevitably brought back purpose-driven action, or selection is the best way to understand it, right? He brought back the idea of selection, and selection is not chaos, right? Selection is not random. Selection is purpose-oriented, and it's purpose-oriented towards the perpetuation of the seed, the perpetuation of the identity. And so
this is the argument that I've been trying to put forth with Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. It's like, you guys, there's a big contradiction here between Darwin and Newton, or the way we look at Newton. It's like, this is a big problem.
And so it's a surprise. It's like, it's a surprise, I think, that nobody kind of expected. And nobody necessarily framed it completely that way, but it did end up bringing back the idea of quality back into the picture, right? Because you choose for a reason, and the reason is something which is closer to your own, the perpetuation of your own identity.
Yes,
and it's like
crafted by evolutionary forces. And so meaning itself is a consequence of the evolutionary process, and how that tangles up with the theological perspective that you brought to bear today. That's an incredibly complicated and difficult problem. But as you said, God calls the earth to manifest its potential. So,
yeah. And so you could, how can I say this? It's like, so you can see it bottom up, which is I mean, I've been expressing it more bottom up recently, just because people are kind of scientifically minded. But you can see it completely top down. Like you can see it as like I was trying to explain to you, as these the evolutionary process of maintaining your identity is a reflection of a deeper pattern, which is a cosmic pattern of how the world actually unfolds. So it's not necessarily that evolutionary process brought about this. It's that the reason why evolutionary processes work the way they do and do what they do is because they're functioning within a larger system.
Yeah, so
they're functioning within, they're imaging, they're manifesting the way the world works. So that's how the world works.
That discussion of subdue starts to become so relevant, because as creatures make their choices and live or die by them, what they are in fact doing is this spiritual process of subduing. And if they do it improperly, then they perish.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's an image, like we were talking about the idea of man at the outset, and so this is represented in iconography, for example, as the image of Christ, Jesus Christ, human Jesus Christ creating the world, which is just like, for people, it just freaks them out, because like, how does this work? How is this possible? But that's the understanding. There is a manner in which how can I say this? And there's a manner in which, just like we have this Christian idea that Christ acts as an axis, which transforms the past and the present, let's say, which kind of acts as this central axis. You could say that intelligence, as it manifests itself in the world, does the same. That is, the human person, human intelligence, goes back into the past and makes sense of it, and goes into the future and makes sense of it. And so you could say that intelligence is at the outset. The things don't exist outside of this capacity to contain them in consciousness. And so so the world is born in consciousness. And the past as well. The past is born in consciousness too. So all those processes that people try to understand, all the Big Bang and all this stuff, it's still born in man. Like, it's still born in consciousness. So the real origin is not the Big Bang. This is going to be the weirdest thing you're going to understand. The real origin is the intelligence, which is able to even perceive the Big Bang or see it as a pattern, as not just a quantum field which never changes. It's like perceiving change, transformation, identity, participating it. Like, that's the origin of reality. So the description in Genesis, I'm trying to help you see that it is an actual description of the origin of the world. It's not a metaphor, like in the way that we want to think about it. It's not just a fairy tale, which is helping us understand things we don't understand. It is describing the manner in which reality originates. And it originates in meaning, then phenomena, not phenomena. Phenomena first as a puzzle, right? I talked about that, like this potential that bubbles up and calls to be answered, and then meaning which comes down. So you can see the same from all scientific theory is like that. It's like something presents itself as a puzzle, and you're like, what is that? And then here comes the logos, the seed, which comes in and patterns it or identifies it, judges it, separates it from other things in the way that happens in the first chapter of Genesis.
Okay, there's two more psychological questions. I'm going to tell them both together because I think they are linked. And Jordan, you may also have something to contribute to that one. How would you work with the problem of inclusive, exclusive categories in these times? Projection, scapegoating. And the other question that's, I think, is related, where do the movements of cancel culture or Black Lives Matter fit, or how to make sense of these movements into this intelligence model? Yeah.
So one of the things we're seeing is we're seeing out of control versions of this identification system or this system of communion. The way in which reality works is fractal. And so communities or identities embed themselves in each other. That's how it works. And so in a normal kind of traditional world, you can be a family, in a neighborhood, in a community, right? In a nation, in a church, And it's like, it's all embedded. And you can also participate in all these different identities. You can be in a club, or you can be in this and that. And so it all kind of works together. So one of the problems we're having right now is that, let's say, kind of woke culture has understood the problem of identity, right? They understand it. They understand the problem of exclusion. But the answer they give is that they want to account for everything. They want everything to fit. Now, the problem is that it's impossible. It's an impossible, and it's even a dangerous thing. And there are a lot of ancient traditions which help you understand that. So, for example, like you have the idea in Jewish law that you have to leave a fringe on your vestment, or you have to leave the corners of the field untilled for the strangers. All of these patterns are there to manifest the fact that you can't have a system which is both coherent and complete at the same time. You can't. Those two things.
Let me interrupt just for a second. Well, the ziggurat answers that question too, because people can be included at a higher level of unity and excluded at a lower. And so part of this is conceptual confusion. It's like the problem of category is the problem of inclusion and exclusion. And exclusion can lead to demonization very easily. And that's a big problem, a fundamental problem. But the problem that you're talking about that's manifesting socially is a consequence of this lack of understanding of the hierarchy of value. So the people who are pushing diversity, inclusivity, and equity are saying something like, look, we're all divinely human. And you object to that by saying, well, yes, but we still need to differentiate ourselves into specialized categories. And we have to think through that very carefully so that we subdue things properly.
No, exactly. And so what's happened is that people want to make inclusivity the only value, really the only value, because of the problem of exclusion. And so what happens, and this is what I'm going to say is going to seem radical to some, but what we're seeing in this process is the actual destruction of the world. And it's actually this type of thinking can actually destroy the world or lead to absolute tyranny, one or the other, or maybe one causing the other. So imagine you have a basketball team, right? You have a basketball team. The purpose of the team is to play basketball, to win the championship, to do this. But then you say, no. The purpose of the team is inclusion. And now imagine you do that for every single level of reality and every single communion. You say that the purpose of your group is inclusion. But so then you sacrifice the actual purpose of the group, which is to play basketball, to win games and everything, for inclusion. And you end up doing that in all aspects of reality. What you're doing is you're devouring the purpose. You're eating it. It's like it's becoming eaten by this thing. It's a monster. It's like it's the potential. It's like potentiality is infinite. It's like you need to let all this potential in. And so we were like, this is wrong, right? You're excluding this potential. So we need to kind of bring all this potential in. So what it does is it's like a sea monster that comes up and devours the identities. And so either it brings about a kind of fragmentation and chaos and breakdown, but often the world can't sustain itself that way. So what it tends to do is it tends to lead into a kind of absolute identity. And it's weird because the way it seems to be happening, it's just the strangest thing, is that it's like people are trying to make inclusivity as the tyrannical system itself, which is seems like it's not possible, but that seems to be what's happening, is that inclusivity is going to turn into tyranny. But what's important is that gesture is going to create something like absolute scapegoats. Absolute scapegoats, which is that those that will refuse to participate in this weird principle of inclusivity will be absolutely excluded. It's the only sin. And it's an unforgivable sin. And so we're moving toward that. And it's kind of scary to see it happen.
Well, it's terminologically part of an assault on the idea of the patriarchy. And that means that it's assault on the idea of pyramidal categorization itself, because that's assimilated in the indiscriminate imagination with tyranny and the identification of tyranny with the act of categorization itself. And so this is a deep struggle, right? So if the act of categorization is part of subduing, and that's part of the manifestation of the word, then the assault on that under the guise of destructuring the patriarchy is an assault on that principle itself, and an identification of the principle of discrimination with the principle of tyranny.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that, for example, like the idea that the word discrimination has become an absolute evil is insane. It's an insane moment because you discriminate all the time. You're constantly discriminating. Discriminating is like a normal aspect of reality, which is that you're constantly judging. Like you're constantly kind of discriminating whether or not this piece of paper is the right one to scribble on or to print on, and you're discriminating whether or not this is the right keyboard for my computer. It's like you're constantly discriminating. But the fact that we've even made that word into
well, you also
sin.
said, Jonathan, that God himself said that capacity for discrimination transformed good into very good.
Yeah.
So now think of what an assault on that means. It means an assault on our ability to distinguish between that which is higher and that which is lower. God.
Yeah. And so, but there's a way in which, like, it's important to understand that there's a way in which this system, like let's say that especially when you see it in many versions, but in the Christian system, the one I know the best, the way in which it kind of heals itself, or the way in which it deals with this problem, is that at the very, very top of the hierarchy is something like identity. And then right above that identity is something like sacrifice. That is, the pyramid is kenotic. It's self-emptying. And so the highest thing is the king. And then the very highest thing is the martyr. And that's super important. It's super important to understand that. And it's technically accurate, right? In the sense that in order for the leg of a chair to be part of the chair, it has to sacrifice itself to the higher purpose. It has to, because it can't just be a leg of a chair. It has to participate in the higher pattern. And so the highest point of the pattern is the negation of identity. And this might be a little hard for people to kind of get, but it'll help you understand a lot of Christian symbolism. The highest point of identity is negation of identity. But the problem is that now what we have is something like, we don't realize that negation of identity leads to identity. Then there's an identity going like this, and then there's a negation of identity below, or a breakdown, and they're confusing the negation of identity below with the negation of identity above, which is the capacity to sacrifice yourself for a higher good, and the capacity to sacrifice yourself for your own parts. And so the chair also has to sacrifice its purity in order to be able to exist, because all chairs have idiosyncrasies. All chairs have aspects of it that aren't the pure chair, or else the chairs couldn't exist. And so the identity of things sacrifice themselves above, they give themselves up, right? So imagine you take your best sheep and you give it up to God, right? You give it up to God. Or you die as a martyr. But then there's also a way in which that which is above then sacrifices itself for that which is below. So that's one of the ways in which we kind of deal with the problem. So it's not like a kind of Nietzschean will to power thing. It's not at all that, right? The real hierarchy ends in self-sacrifice, right? That's why the cross is at the top of the hill, right? That's why the mystery at the top of the hill is, in mystical terms, we talk about the divine unknowing, like that you reach knowledge, you reach gnosis. And then when you reach the top of gnosis, the next step is unknowing. It's actually a form of divine darkness. That's the highest form of mystical union. And this is how one of the ways in which the system can balance itself out. Because it is true that sometimes we struggle to think that the highest thing is, okay, let's think of it this way. The highest thing of the team is the quarterback that everybody loves and everybody worships. And it's like, yeah, that is the top of the team, but it's only the top of the team when the quarterback sacrifices himself above to the purpose of the team and sacrifices himself below to make the other team members participate in the team. If he doesn't do that, then he's not going to be at the top. He's going to be a tyrant. He's not going to be able to get the team to cohere. All of these things are going to happen. And so this is something which, like I said, it's maybe a bit harder to understand. I really didn't expect to go into this in this conversation, but it might be important to understand the problem of identity and how it can be solved, let's say, through this pattern.
Okay, another question, maybe a big one. I don't know if it can be summarized. What is the intelligence of dreams? Jung suggested the dream is the purest expression of individuating intelligence. This seems at odds with the orthodox view. Can the two views be reconciled?
It's very difficult. So the orthodox view, or the way that the fathers talk about dreams, is that they are mostly chaos, that they're mostly this lower waters, this kind of these moving waters, and that you have to be careful not to pay too much attention to them. But like I said, so there's an interesting image. For example, like let me give you an image that you find in the Revelation. It says in Revelation, at the end of time, the sea will become like glass. The sea will become like crystal. And so that's the way you can kind of understand the purpose of dreams, is that it's this lower potential that's kind of bubbling up, right? And so it manifests all your passions, all your desires in a kind of wild way that sometimes is illogical, that it's kind of breakdown of logic. But then once in a while, you could say through divine providence or through ascesis, like that is through, like, let's say the mystic who will transform himself and will kind of reduce their slavery to the passions. At some point, this potential can still itself, can become still, and then it becomes a mirror, because it is a mirror in the first place, right? It's already a mirror, because that's where reality comes out of. Reality kind of comes out of this potential. That's the earth is pulled out of the waters. All of this is true, and so you can understand it that way. It's like the chaos and this kind of madness and chaos on the edge, out of which reality comes. And you have to be careful not to pay too much attention to it, because it can break you down. But once in a while, it becomes this pure mirror, and then that's the vision, right? That's the mystic's vision. That's the capacity to see reality more clearly than you ever could, because suddenly it becomes a mirror for the highest things. So it's like, one of the things you might have seen when you see the pattern of creation is that God is going like this, right? So the waters, the earth, and then the grass, the stars, and then it's like it's kind of moving in this way. So you can understand it as these extremes, but you can also understand that the lowest part can become a mirror for the highest part in the proper circumstance. It can become like this. That's one of the things Christ does, by the way. Christ, that's one of if you want to understand the story of Jesus, he goes to the bottom of reality and then kind of transforms it into glory. Anyways, little tidbit on that.
Okay, I'm aware of the time. I'm also aware we could go on for hours and hours. So Jonathan, I don't know how you're doing about time. You want to take one last question?
I'm fine. Yeah, if you want, I'm totally fine. I went too long in my presentation anyway, so I'm willing to accept more questions.
Okay, if the teleological patterns of being constitute the realm of heaven, what then is the abode of the individual human soul? In other words, what is the relationship between the semi-Platonic conception you've presented here and the standard Christian model of heaven as a domain of souls?
And so they're the same. That is, that your soul is your invisible part of you. It's the patterning of your being, right? That's what your soul is. And there's a way, and there's a way in which that soul, in its very center, right? You could say that there's a hierarchy of patterns in you, and at the core of that hierarchy of pattern is God. I don't know what to tell you, like that it's the spark of the divine is at the center of every individual soul. that's the manner in which we actually exist, is that we contain a spark of the divine, and that as we commune with each other, as we love each other, then we become this embodied pattern, and your individual logos joins with the divine logos and becomes the body of Christ. And so that's the way that it works. And so you can understand it in different ways. You can understand it as physically, how can I say this? That Christ says things like, you are called to be like angels. And he says, you are gods. And what he means is that human beings can become patterns for other human beings. Right? We become models. That's why we have models. We have models because humans can move up into heaven. We can ascend into heaven, and then we become patterns for others. And we become patrons for others. So we name a church after someone. We name a city after someone. We name things after people because those beings are like gods. They become patterns for the rest of us. And so that's actually how reality works. Reality doesn't hold together by ideas. Even your nations, they don't hold together by ideal. They hold together by a succession of people who modeled behavior on which you base yourself. And some of those rise up very high and become the patron saints of entire aspects of reality. And that's how they become like angels. They become gods in the divine council. Right? They become co-rulers with Christ. All these things that Christ talks about. And these are things that can happen at a very small level, right? Your own father, your own mother can image for you how to be like, how to live and how to be. And then that can scale up, all the way to St. Peter and St. Paul, or the Mother of God, or the saints which are venerated as being like in the divine council.
Thank you so much for a great talk. And Jordan and Tommy, thank you so much for your participation.
Yeah, this has been great. I'm really happy because let me say this, is that I was hoping that this discussion would push me further in saying things in a certain way and kind of bringing things together. And I'm very grateful because I feel like it has. And so I appreciate Jordan, you pushing me, and I think the questions were wonderful. And so it's actually been a great opportunity for myself to just say, okay, I'm going to try as hard as I can to really bring this together. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry for those who we didn't have time to ask their questions. Only so many questions, so little time.
I'll just jump in. If like me, you didn't have a chance to ask a question, maybe you can attend another Young Society of Montreal event, and we'll form our group with our purpose and continue in these rituals.
Very good.
All right, thanks everybody.